Since you're living abroad, you probably don't need any property in the US, right? That old, dilapidated house where our grandparents lived should be enough for you. After our mother passed away, I hurried back to the US to attend her funeral. That's when I found out that my sister had unilaterally decided how to divide the inheritance, without consulting me at all. Thus, I ended up inheriting the old house our grandparents used to live in. When I went to see it later, it was in such a dilapidated state that it seemed uninhabitable. Even if I were to repair it, it looked like the costs would be substantial. However, thinking of how dearly my mother had cherished this house of our grandparents, I started cleaning it up. Then, I found something unexpected and significant there. I am in my 40s and married. When my husband decided to work abroad, I didn't hesitate to go with him. My job doesn't require a specific location as long as I have an internet connection. So there was no need to worry about following my husband abroad. I'm currently working as a freelancer. I have an older sister who is also married. Her husband works in a rural area, so they chose a house near his workplace and enjoy a relaxed life in the suburbs. Even after my sister and I got married, our parents lived healthily for a while. However, a few years ago, our father fell ill and passed away. My parents were very close, so my mother became depressed after my father's death and grew physically and mentally weaker. Ideally, my sister and I should have discussed what to do about our mother together. But my sister began to act on her own. She left her husband in the countryside and moved back to our parents' house by herself. Thus, she started living with our mother at our family home, but I was not informed about this at all. I should have offered financial support since I was in a situation where returning to the US was difficult. However, our relationship has been poor since childhood, to the point where we hardly spoke even at our father's funeral. As my sister and mother were not on bad terms, I thought everything must be fine and didn't initiate contact. However, my mother became ill due to her depression and, despite her struggle, eventually passed away. I hurried back to the US to attend her funeral. I regretted not visiting her while she was still healthy, thinking that I could have lived with her after returning to the US. I was in a daze of grief, having just finished the funeral. Then, one day, soon after the funeral, my sister came with a lawyer to discuss the division of the inheritance. Look, you live abroad, so you don't need the inheritance, right? Besides, I was the one who took care of our mother until the end. You understand what this means, don't you? It seemed my sister had already investigated and understood the details of the property our mother left behind. Bringing a lawyer with her suggested she had no intention of allowing me to argue. But you know, if I inherit everything, there would be social issues, right? So, I'll give you that old house our grandparents used. The house my sister offered to pass on to me was the old one our grandparents had lived in, over 100 years old. I remember that after our grandparents passed away, my mother inherited and managed it. However, I had never heard any details about the house from her. According to the lawyer, after my father died, my mother became depressed and her physical strength declined. so the house wasn't actively maintained thereafter. Therefore, I was told I could renounce my inheritance since its current condition was unclear. I wondered if this was true or just a scheme to make me give up the inheritance. Nonetheless, I decided to take over the house, thinking that it was important to my mother, who cared for it until her strength waned. In the end, I inherited only this old house. On the other hand, my sister seemed to have inherited a significant amount, including our family home, the land, and all of our mother's savings. Our grandparents' house was a traditional American dwelling, a place of many happy memories for me. As a child, I often visited, enjoying the surrounding nature and playing games like hide and seek, running around the house. My sister, with whom I had a strained relationship since those days, also came. But she never liked the house. She always disliked the countryside with its bugs and the old-fashioned atmosphere. Furthermore, the old house was dark and cluttered, which scared my sister, so she avoided it. While it was a place of wonderful memories for me, it held no such fondness for my sister, who likely pushed the responsibility of dealing with it onto me. However, a considerable amount of time had passed since my mother was no longer able to manage the house. I expected some deterioration, both inside and out, but the reality was far worse than I anticipated. Firstly, the weeds around the house had grown taller than me, obscuring my view. The overgrown branches and roots made it difficult to even approach the house, making it evident from the outside that the house was severely neglected. Despite this, I decided I needed to see the condition for myself and set about clearing the weeds to reach the house. I had to determine whether the house was salvageable and repairable or if it was so dilapidated that it needed to be demolished, possibly causing trouble for the neighbors. Initially, I thought I could manage the weed clearing by myself, but the task was overwhelming. The amount of time and effort it would take to do this alone was daunting. So, I hired a service to remove the weeds and trees, clearing a path to the house. Later, I received a call from the contractor informing me that the clearing work at the designated location was complete. I headed to my grandparents' house again, and finally, I was able to see the house with my own eyes. The exterior was in poor condition, clearly suffering from neglect. The deterioration of the outer walls was so severe that it was evident the house needed to be demolished. Inside, the condition was even worse than what the exterior suggested. The floor was almost completely rotted, and there were holes in the ceiling. Areas hit by rainwater showed signs of severe leaking, with rotted floorboards. It was difficult to thoroughly inspect the house as some areas made creaking sounds under my feet, indicating that the floors might give way. However, I could see that my mother had gradually tried to organize the house after inheriting it. Still, a lot of furniture and items remained inside. Even though I planned to demolish the house, I decided to clear out as much as possible before doing so, for closure. I was told by the service company that it might take several days or weeks before they could start. The trees surrounding the house were hindering the entry of heavy machinery, so their removal was necessary first. It was expected to take several weeks before the demolition could begin. So in the meantime, I prioritized visiting my grandparents' house on good weather days. One day, while clearing out the kitchen area, I made a surprising discovery. It seemed my mother thought the kitchen essentials were necessary, as cooking utensils and dishes were left just as they were, almost as if life in that part had continued. There was no food left, but there were unopened, expired condiments. Curious, I gently opened the storage under the floor and, as expected, found jars used for pickling. My grandmother was skilled at making pickles, which were exceptional. Even after I stopped visiting, she would send them to me regularly. Of course, it was unlikely that any pickles were still there. While thinking this, I tried to lift the jar, and it was quite heavy. There was definitely something inside. Could it be that the pickles were still there? I was a mix of expectation and anxiety about what might be inside. When I cautiously opened the lid, to my amazement, it was overflowing with gold items. Not only that, but there were also documents with the gold, indicating that my grandparents had bought these gold items with money from selling their land. I was supposed to inherit only my grandparents' house. But was it all right for me to inherit these gold items as well? I knew that telling my sister would undoubtedly lead to trouble. So, I decided to consult with my mother's sister, my aunt. According to my aunt, it was true that my grandparents had sold part of their ancestral land during their time. The only land left was where my grandparents' house stood. My aunt, suffering from a chronic illness and considering her health, said it was difficult for her to manage the family home. Since I inherited the house, she left all decisions regarding the gold items to me. It was a relief to have these gold items, as demolishing the old house would be costly. She proposed that I handle everything, as there was no guarantee that selling the cleared land would cover the costs. I gratefully accepted her suggestion. Given the current high price of gold, converting the items into cash would more than cover the demolition costs. Indeed, when I exchanged the gold items, they fetched a higher price than expected. I used this money to cover the demolition costs, clear the surrounding weeds, and dispose of unwanted items from inside the house. On the day of the demolition, I decided to be present until the end, along with my aunt. For me, my grandparents' house was filled with childhood memories, and for my aunt, it was where she grew up. During the demolition, my aunt said, "I'm sorry for letting it get so run down. I neglected it for so long." She uttered words of apology. I reassured my regretful aunt, "Don't worry. Grandpa, Grandma, and Mom are probably thankful that we're here to see the house to the end." Hearing this, my aunt seemed relieved and expressed her gratitude that I had taken over the inheritance. With the house demolition and cleanup completed, I felt relieved that I could do what my mother couldn't finish. After everything was settled, I returned to where my husband was waiting. The following year, after my mother's passing, my husband and I returned to the U.S. for the first anniversary of her death. I hadn't seen my sister since the one-sided discussion about the inheritance. After the memorial service, she asked, "What happened to that old house?" I decided not to hide anything and explained that the house was too old to use. So I demolished it and sold the land. The land where my grandparents' house stood was quite spacious. Fortunately, a buyer was found smoothly, and the process went without any issues. However, upon hearing this, my sister's expression tightened, and she exclaimed, "I wasn't informed about this." Furthermore, she demanded that if money had been received from the sale of the land, half of that money should be given to her. If I had known that old house could be turned into money, I wouldn't have let you inherit it. Indeed, the old house was in poor condition and could not have been used without significant effort and expenses. But it's also true that I put considerable effort and expense into making it valuable. I deliberately kept silent about using the money from the gold items for the demolition. If I had revealed that, she would have mercilessly demanded a share of that money too. I firmly refused my sister's excited demands, saying, "I cannot comply. The inheritance was unfair from the start. Therefore, there was no need for me to share the proceeds from the land I sold and inherited. If she insisted on getting half the money, it would be fair only if she shared half of the inheritance she received with me." But my sister, displeased by my response, began to make a scene in front of the relatives gathered for the memorial service. "What? This greedy woman? Who gave you permission to demolish that house? Doing everything on your own, and even getting money from selling it," she accused, implying my actions were unjust. My aunt, who had been silent, stepped in to defend me, saying she had asked me to take care of the family home's clearing and disposal. My aunt confronted my sister, but this only infuriated her more. "Shut up. Outsiders should stay out of this. This is an issue between us sisters. Don't butt in," my sister snapped, pushing my aunt away. Unexpectedly, my aunt staggered and fell to the ground. I rushed to my aunt, helping her up while scolding my sister. "How could you do that, sister?" But my sister insisted it was my fault for disposing of the property without consultation. Moreover, she said, "That old woman falling down is just a nuisance. Let's have a thorough discussion among us siblings and our spouses." So we, along with our spouses, sat down in another room for a discussion. First, my husband explained the hardships I faced in dealing with the inherited family home. Due to his work, he couldn't return from abroad. So I stayed in the U.S. alone, from clearing the house to finalizing the land sale. It was fortunate that a buyer for the land was found quickly, but had it not been, I would have needed to return repeatedly. My job, though flexible as long as I have the internet and a computer, doesn't mean I can use my time freely. Balancing communication with my husband across time zones and handling the procedures was honestly tough and taxing. Then, my husband mentioned the investments made to clear the inherited house. He didn't reveal the gold items as the source of our funds, but stated that if my sister demanded half of the land sale proceeds, it was only fair to split the expenses incurred so far. My husband made it clear that the discussion couldn't progress unless the expenses were shared equally. But he firmly stated that there was no intention to split the proceeds from the sale of the land. Originally, my sister had inherited a considerable amount, which should have been more than what I received from the land sale. Yet, to demand even more money, I wondered what that was all about. In the inheritance, the distribution was never equal from the beginning. It might have been impossible to split the land itself, but it would have been possible, and perhaps preferable, to split our mother's savings. If, after dividing it equally, there were still disagreements over the amount, we could have discussed it. Both parties could have considered an amount they were satisfied with. I conveyed to my sister these thoughts I couldn't express when she unilaterally decided on the inheritance distribution. As we continued this discussion, my sister's husband unexpectedly asked, "How much did my wife inherit?" My husband and I were taken aback by the question. It seemed my sister hadn't disclosed the inherited amount to her own husband. Learning the amount, her husband showed shock and anger, demanding to know how such a large sum could have disappeared. Reluctantly, my sister confessed that the money no longer existed. Having been spent within a year, we were stunned. While it was possible that she spent the money on a house, she had returned to her husband's side after our mother's death without any such purchase. If she had bought a house, her husband would have known about it. At first, my sister tried to avoid the topic and change the subject. But she must have been frightened when her usually calm husband slammed the table and pressed for the truth. She began to speak in a feeble, hesitant voice, revealing the real situation. It turned out that my sister had become deeply involved in illegal gambling, incurring debts large enough to buy a house, and kept losing. She could not repay these debts with the inherited money, and her debts continued to grow, making repayment increasingly difficult. One reason she was so desperate for the proceeds from the sale of my land was to use it for repaying these debts. Her debts were mounting, compounded by illegal interest, worsening the situation. My sister, who had always been a housewife without even a part-time job, had no income. Yet, it was a mystery where she found the money for her illegal gambling bets. Even her husband, who thought it strange, was pressing her to reveal the source of the betting money. Pressed further, she confessed that the source of her gambling funds was their joint savings. Her husband checked the savings account balance, finding it completely depleted. Enraged that she had squandered their savings without his knowledge, he confronted her physically. Their argument escalated into a physical altercation. In the midst of the chaos, my sister resisted, and in the scuffle, she ended up injuring her husband. The commotion alerted the other relatives, who rushed in to intervene. Amidst this, my aunt revealed important information to my sister. "You often came to our parents' home and took valuable items, didn't you? Your mother knew all about it. She also mentioned that her time was limited, and she wanted to see her other daughter, asking you to contact me, but you never did." My aunt then showed us a letter written by our mother. I was puzzled why such a letter was surfacing now and asked my aunt about it. After my sister monopolized the inheritance, my aunt hoped she would settle all issues and start over. Therefore, my aunt had decided not to reveal the letter's contents, keeping it to herself. But as my sister became increasingly greedy and demanding, my aunt could no longer stay silent. She wanted to reveal the truth in front of the family and the seriousness of my sister's actions, which included theft. Among the items my sister had taken and sold were ancestral treasures that our mother had cherished. Later, my sister was unilaterally informed by her husband that he wanted a divorce. He demanded that she return the misused money, threatening legal action if she failed to comply. Reluctantly, my sister agreed, but soon after, she received a demand for compensation. My sister's debts were severe, borrowed from illegal lenders, and she was being pursued wherever she went. Having never held a regular job and struggling even with part-time work, she found it impossible to repay her debts and was being coerced into illegal activities. This put her at risk of becoming a criminal, leaving her in a dire situation. Her reckless spending was clearly the cause of her predicament, a case of reaping what she sowed. I returned to the U.S. with my husband, whose job had relocated back to the country. With the remaining money from the land sale, we bought a house and are living a happy married life. My freelance work is going well, and despite being busy, my days are fulfilling. My aunt has recently regained her health and occasionally visits us. I spend each day hoping that this happiness lasts forever.